It is wonderful to have a chance to actually come and celebrate one issue that seems to be going in the right direction.
Here, here.
Jean Lee on our Justice Center staff actually made some rainbow flag cupcakes that I hope you'll all take as a symbol of this moment, and the fact that our folks is resigning as budget director. But that's a different luncheon. But we're really thrilled that you're here to talk about, as I mentioned, one of the issues that is long overdue and finally going in the right direction. And here to tell you about it is Rob Schofield.
Thanks, Chris. Before I do talk about today's luncheon, I want to mention that 2 weeks from today we'll be having one, should be a very interesting one. Ian Millhiser, who works at the Center for American Progress in Washington and is one of their courts and law experts, will be here to talk about Hobby Lobby and the Supreme Court term that we've just endured, and to what we have to look forward to this fall. So that should be so please be on the lookout. We'll be announcing that tomorrow. It'll be on the website. That's Thursday, August 21st here in Raleigh. Here at the same venue. But of course today the topic is marriage equality, and the recent ruling by the Supreme Court, by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in the Bostic versus Schaeffer case prompted a great deal of justifiable celebration by equality supporters in North Carolina and around the country, and that was followed up, of course, by Attorney General Cooper's quick follow-up announcement that the state would no longer seek to defend the marriage discrimination amendment that was enacted in 2012 now, just 2 years ago, Amendment 1. So that only added to the happiness. But of course the problem is that it's still not the law. Marriage equality is still not the law in North Carolina. We're not there yet. So what's the deal? Where do things stand? What happens next? And perhaps more importantly, what should all of us be doing to help push things over the finish line? Today we explore these questions with some of the most knowledgeable and committed people in the state of North Carolina working on this subject. Chris Brook, who's in the middle here, and is familiar to most of you, I'm sure, is the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of North Carolina, where he oversees the organization's legal program and its work in a wide range of constitutional law issues, including LGBT rights, racial justice, and religious liberty. Brook joined the ACLU as its legal director in May of 2012, right around the time we were passing the amendment, I guess. His practice areas correspond with the ACLU's civil liberties focus, touching particularly on racial justice and LGBT issues, as well as First and Fourth Amendment concerns. In his time at ACLU-NC, he has worked to safeguard religious liberty in public schools, fought against Amendment 1, and to narrow its potential collateral consequence. And he's worked to protect free assembly rights in Charlotte during the Democratic National Convention. He's also a member of North Carolina Advocates for Justice Racial Justice Task Force. He's a native of Raleigh, and he came to the ACLU after stints in private practice and with Southern Coalition for Social Justice. To his right is Jen Jones. Jen joined the Equality North Carolina staff in March 2011 as the organization's first communications director. She's working closely with Equality North Carolina's organizing and development staff. Jen plays a leadership role in all facets of the organization's communications efforts, including traditional and social media engagement and project promotion. She's also a native North Carolinian. She received her undergraduate degree from UNC at Chapel Hill and a law degree from North Carolina Central. And then here on the left is Shawn Long. Shawn has also worked at Equality NC for many years, but he is also a plaintiff in the lawsuit that is being pursued against the state of North Carolina. He's an NC State man. Got a Wolfpack shirt on. He studied writing and editing there, and of course with his partner Craig Johnson, who's featured on their photos featured on the advertisement for this event on our website. His partner of 18 years, Craig Johnson. They live in Wake Forest with their son. I'm sorry?
20 years.
It's now 20 years. It's an old announcement. Sorry about that. 2 full decades. And they're now, how old is Isaiah now?
He's 12.
He's 12. Their son Isaiah is 12. So it's a great panel. Chris is going to tell us what the heck's going on in the courts, where things stand, what's next. Jen's going to talk to us more about what we need to be doing next, what Equality NC is doing, and Shawn's going to talk about this issue from his perspective as a plaintiff in the case and what it means to him. So without further ado, I'm going to go to Chris Brook.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, and thank you also to Chris and to Policy Watch for having us here today. I want to state right at the outset that Jen Jones and I did not have a conversation about what we were going to wear before we showed up today. This just randomly occurred. I think that's a really nice sweater.
It's really like fun.
I really like your sweater. But as Rob has indicated, and anybody who's been following the news certainly knows, it's been an exceptionally exciting time with all of the legal developments in the marriage equality movement. And I think it's important to sort of start by recognizing as a lawyer that what we're seeing right now does not happen very frequently. The law moves very slowly, typically. And in this, and oftentimes in fits and starts, where you'll take 2 steps forward and then a step back, and that is not what has happened here. We've been moving very quickly, going up towards the Windsor and Perry decisions, respectively striking down Section 3 of the so-called Defensive Marriage Act, as well as striking down California's marriage ban up to that point, but then moving very quickly since that point. The Fourth Circuit, I've lost count, but I believe the correct count is that the Fourth Circuit was the 20th court to strike down a state marriage ban in the past year. It's a huge number. And there have been a number of cases that have weighed in on other LGBT issues using the logic from Windsor. So it's been exceptionally fast progress. Just yesterday, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati heard 4 district court cases that had been appealed up to it that had struck down 4 state marriage bans: Michigan, Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. And we're going to see what happens in that case. Very conservative panel, but Fourth Circuit was the second circuit court that struck down a state marriage ban since Windsor, and I think it's important to sort of put that in some context in the federal court system for folks who are not attorneys who are out there, because it's not necessarily super intuitive. The way that the federal court system works is you go from district courts. We have 3 district courts in North Carolina, in the eastern, the middle, and the western districts. And at the other end of the spectrum is the U.S. Supreme Court. In the middle are circuit courts that generally encompass a number of states. The Fourth Circuit is based out of Richmond, Virginia, and is South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia. So the Fourth Circuit decision focused exclusively on and was a challenge to Virginia's state marriage ban. But it has implications for all of the states in the Fourth Circuit that also have state marriage bans. So Maryland actually has marriage equality via a vote in 2012, but South Carolina, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Virginia all still have marriage bans in place. So Bostic, said that Virginia's marriage ban could not be squared with the 14th Amendment's guarantee of due process and its recognition of the fundamental right to marry. It also, even though it was not in front of it, referenced the South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina marriage bans in a footnote. So there is a reference in Bostic to Amendment 1, and it's basically sort of implicitly saying, yes, this opinion is limited on its face to Virginia's marriage ban, but it's legally indistinguishable from North Carolina's marriage ban. What Bostic said was there's a fundamental right to marry, and if the state is going to categorically exclude gays and lesbians from that fundamental right to marry, there needs to be exceptionally compelling state interest that's brought to bear, and all of the interests that Virginia brought forward, which are the same arguments that North Carolina has been making, don't cut it. So the writing is very much on the wall for Amendment 1. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of hubbub about the Attorney General announcing later that same day that he would no longer defend North Carolina's marriage ban. The legislature, who gave itself the right to intervene in these sorts of cases, made some noises about how they were disappointed by that, potentially looking to intervene in the case in the future. Yeah, I would just submit to you that I'm not really sure what Attorney General Cooper was supposed to do, according to them.
Right.
Circuit courts govern district courts in North Carolina. Our legal argument is not going to be particularly sophisticated. We're going to walk in, show Bostic to the court, and just sort of walk out. I mean, okay. You lose right there. So, when you hear the legislature say that, I think you need to ask yourself, what are they suggesting that the Attorney General argue in court? And after a while, isn't enough enough? Enough energy, time, money has been devoted to this effort. And when 20 courts, however many courts, all reach the same conclusion, it's pretty plain you're defending the indefensible. So where do we go after Bostic? One of the Bostic decision does not go into effect for 21 days due to some procedural reasons, so it would be still about 2 weeks from now before it would go into effect. Late last week, one of the clerks who's defending the Virginia marriage ban asked the Fourth Circuit to stay that decision pending their appeal. They have the opportunity to seek rehearing by that 3-judge panel or en banc review, which would be all 15 judges on the Fourth Circuit hearing the case. I think the most likely outcome is they will appeal directly to the Supreme Court because it was a very representative panel of the Fourth Circuit that struck down Virginia's marriage ban. If you could not win in front of that panel, you're not going to win en banc. So I think that there'll probably be an appeal up there to the Supreme Court in the Virginia case relatively quickly. What does that mean for Amendment 1? There are 4 marriage cases that have been filed in North Carolina. The ACLU of North Carolina has filed 2 of them, along with ACLU National, the Fisher-Born case, which Craig and Shawn are a part of, that was filed in 2012, amended to become, originally a second parent adoption case, amended to become a marriage case in 2013. That case is pending, along with Gerber versus Cooper, where we represent a number of families that really need to have marital recognition now because they are families that are dealing with real health consequences. So being able to make medical decisions for their spouses, extend medical benefits to their children is a now concern. I mean, all of these concerns are important in the immediate sense, but even more so Gerber versus Cooper. Those cases are pending in Greensboro in front of Judge Osteen, who's the chief judge there. Judge Osteen a week ago today entered an order asking for the parties to brief on what Bostic means by a week from today, and implied in that order that what I just said, that he and the Middle District is governed by the Bostic decision. In fact, one of the clerks has already made their filing, who's defending the lawsuit, Catawba County clerk, which I believe is Newton and maybe Hickory. So a relatively conservative county. She came in and filed yesterday and said Bostic controls. So there's not going to be, I don't think, any argument here. But I also think it's not necessarily given that marriages will start happening anytime soon or soon enough in North Carolina. The Supreme Court did stay. The Utah case was one of the first cases that moved. They struck down Utah's marriage ban and did not stay it. The 10th Circuit refused to stay that as well. The Supreme Court at that point did move in and stay the impact of that decision. There's an argument that similar things might happen. One way or the other, the Supreme Court's going to have an appeal teed up, ready for it, either later at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. So they could at that point say, we don't want to hear any of these cases. Everybody's gotten the message from Windsor. These state marriage bans are unconstitutional, but our work here is done. And if that's the case, I think marriages could happen in North Carolina as soon as early next year. There's also, perhaps with the personalities and egos involved on the Supreme Court, a more likely outcome, which is that they will take the case and Justice Kennedy will want to finish the work that he started with the Romer and Windsor's decisions that have been really, made him sort of the Thurgood Marshall of the LGBT rights movement judicially. And if that's the case, I think they could hear the case in 2015 and rule in the spring or summer of 2015. It's also possible that they could hold off until 2016. But this is a very long way, and I've always talked longer than I mean to, of saying that at this point, we're not talking about if Amendment 1 gets struck down. We're talking about when Amendment 1 gets struck down. And plainly, that day cannot come soon enough. But we are now very, very close. And we need to push that as much as possible to make that day come as soon as possible, so that these families can have the protections that come with marriage. But we are really, if not on the last lap, very close to it at this point.
So Jen?
So everything else, what do we do now?
Yeah.
We've been fortunate to partner with the ACLU of North Carolina for the past 2 years and 3 months and 49 minutes on a campaign to tell stories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender families all across this great state. When we realized that sheer visibility in a fight for marriage and equality in the state of North Carolina is the victory. I remember running through Fayetteville and being stopped by a reporter who asked me, were there couples who I could talk to about how detrimental Amendment 1 would be to them. And I was able to turn to the reporter and say, no, there are not. Every couple we have talked to at this rally, at these events, is afraid of losing their job if they talk to you. So while we talk a lot in marriage about stays and not stays, of legal opinions, there are no stays on the legal inequities of our daily lives in North Carolina. There will be no stays on those inequities. And so while this momentum with marriage is happening, we have to do something. Now, short of being Chris Brook, it's going to be very difficult for North Carolinians to seek a resolution to the marriage equality issue. As I have said many times, that will come raining down on us like so many rainbow unicorns. It is as inevitable as the film The Matrix. It is going to happen, and as Chris says, it is not an if, but when prospect. So what do average North Carolinians do in the meantime to move it forward? And I will say that Amendment 1, if that wasn't losing forward, I don't know what was. We now have networks of hundreds of thousands of people all across our great state who are mobilizing around marriage and who are ready to take action. And I will tell you, from now until eternity, every year is the most important election year we have ever had in North Carolina. But before I get into that, I want to say that if Equality NC were to lead a day one action, if we went to communities all across this great state, starting apparently in Catawba County, to mobilize same-gender couples for the day one prospect, whether it's a window of opportunity created by Chris or a window of opportunity created by Justice Kennedy with the Supreme Court, to marry day one, we would have to be very clear with couples all across this great state what that would mean. First and foremost, we'd have to say, when we got you to the church on time, when we went to the Register of Deeds office, where we met you and officiants to throw the bouquet and the roses and do the exchange of rings and kisses, what we would also have to talk about is your workplace ready? Is it friendly? Is the prospect that you're going to go back to your office, let's assume you don't have any vacation time for a honeymoon, and you go back to the office and you put a picture of your spouse on your desk, you just married them the day before, it was the most beautiful wedding ceremony of all time, and you were summarily fired. Not for reasons that have anything to do with job performance, but because you are gay or transgender in North Carolina. Or if you do have vacation time, let's go to your favorite innkeep and ask them for a stay at the honeymoon hotspot of your choice. And they say, as Bill James did back in 2011 to justify the passage of Amendment 1, we don't want your kind here. So we have to work not only on workplace non-discrimination now more than ever, but also public accommodations and housing. Now the media are going to be at this ceremonious event in Catawba County where we pull couples together to get them married on day one. And you will be in the spotlight as LGBT people in North Carolina. If you have children, what will happen to them the next day when they go to school? Well, we're already learning that if they go to a charter school or a private school in North Carolina that are now taxpayer funded, they could be turned away. This is the environment we are currently living in. So I would like to say to you now, for people who feel like you don't have anything to do, because Chris is going to handle this. He's got this, and he does. It's the sweater. Let's do it. There are plenty of things to do. You can join us today, sign a petition. We're going to deliver tens of thousands of them to the governor and state leaders in the coming weeks, demanding that they do not spend 1 red cent of our money defending the indefensible ban we now know as Amendment 1. But we also have petitions that we're sending to lawmakers, and we're making loud and clear that at the very moment we're talking about the inevitability of marriage equality, now is the time to pass a statewide ban on discrimination against gay and transgender workers, including teachers, in the state of North Carolina. Now, or 2015, let's do it 2015. And so that will be the focus, is marriage plus. What's next after marriage? Because we've all done an amazing job of telling our stories. But until we have a living equality in North Carolina, and I'll tell you this story. I ran across this state during the Amendment 1 fight, and I went to a lot of towns where there were a couple of hundred people, and half of them didn't like me very much because of who I was and who I love. And after Amendment, I wasn't afraid then, because if you have a conversation with a North Carolinian, you can get them on board with you. You can. We used to talk in terms of there's some people you can't move. I don't believe that anymore on issues of equality. But what I will say is that after Amendment 1 passed, there were places I was afraid to go in my state. And I'm nearly 875 years old and have lived here all of my life. And that's a long time to feel safe and then suddenly not. If I felt that way in places like Asheville, then I would imagine there are some other LGBT people in this state that feel the same. And so living equality every day is what we were seeking. So that even in the most rural areas, and there are more of them than there are of us, we feel safe, comforted, loved, not just tolerated and accepted, but like it's home. So I hope you will join with us after this and be a part of this movement for marriage, but also post-marriage, to create a living equality that we also desperately need now more than ever in the state of North Carolina. I hope you're with us.
Got 2 tough acts to follow there, Shawn.
I don't have a whole lot to add. Good grief. I'm certainly grateful for Chris and the ACLU for the amazing work that they've done, Jen Jones and Equality NC, which are changing the face of North Carolina. Thank you all so much for everything that you're doing. The reason I'm up here is because of my partner of 20 years and our son, Isaiah, who's age 12. I was mentioning earlier, Craig and I adopted Isaiah through the foster care system. And I don't know how many people have gone through foster care or adoption. There's a huge process involved. I mean, we had to have criminal background checks, we had to have our fingerprints taken, we had to have our house inspected by the fire marshal, we had to change locks, install fire extinguishers, have an evacuation plan. We had to do all these, we had to go to classes for several months just to become foster parents. And eventually we were certified and both became foster dads to Isaiah. We were foster dads for a couple of months, and we had already decided we were going to adopt him. So we went ahead, did the paperwork. The thing is, in North Carolina, only one same-sex person can adopt a child. You can only adopt a child jointly if you're married, and of course, a gay couple can't be married. So, Craig adopts Isaiah, he's the father, and bam, I'm nothing. I am like no relation. I'm just some guy who happens to live in the same house. And that is incredibly stressful. The first time kid got sick and Craig couldn't do anything, he was out of town and couldn't come get him, so I rush off to the school. I get kid, he has a horrible fever, he's throwing up, it's horrible. I grab him, I toss him in the car, we rush off to the doctor, and I get to the doctor, and as I'm checking him in, I'm just like, what if the doctor says to me, you're not a parent, you can't do anything with this kid. Fortunately, the doctor was great, took kid in, found out what was wrong with him, got him medicine, so that was fine. But there's so many situations where that might not have worked out okay. And it's a horrible feeling. And no parent should feel that, and no kid should be in a situation where they don't have the protections that come with having a family that's legally recognized. And that is what we're looking for. Just the same legal recognitions as other families get. And it maddens me that there are people out there who are like, no, you can't get married. Your kid can't have the same rights as other married couples. Because I'm like, why? What do you care? How does this impact your life in any way? You're not taking my son to the doctor. You're not taking him to soccer. What does this have to do with you? But the great thing is, once we do have marriage equality, everyone will win. These people that have been against it, their lives won't be impacted negatively, and then their friends and their family who are gay can get married, and their kids will be protected. It's just a good thing that will benefit everyone. And it makes no sense that, here in North Carolina, where we had to amend the Constitution to stop everyone from having equal rights here in America, that we should have people that are singled out as, everyone is equal except for you guys. We're amending the Constitution. You guys are not cool anymore. But it's great to see that the courts are stepping in where they need to reaffirm the ideal of equality and fairness for everyone. And that's all that we want. I mean, we are all part of the great melting pot, and we just all deserve full participation in it. And I want my son to grow up in that environment, and I want him to have the protection of two legal parents. So that's what I want. He's my heart, my son. I love him. So that's all I have to say.
Speaking of our children, I think it's apt to note that there is legislation currently on the governor's desk still, is that right? House
yes.
793. There is legislation on the governor's desk that at one point would have offered specifically protection for LGBT children in our charter schools in the state, and that was amended during the legislative process to take that protection out. So that's an interesting, there are many other problems with that legislation that's currently on the governor's desk. That's an example of how so many issues still remain to be dealt with, even when we get the victory that we all want so badly on marriage equality. So we have a wonderful panel. We have some time for questions. We had someone who asked, where's Tracy at? Tracy, right in front. No wonder. She'd asked me ahead of time, but she's with Marriage Equality USA. She's moved to Raleigh recently, back to Raleigh after being away. She had a question and a suggestion or two. I told her I'd let her have the first shot at things and at our panel.
Thank you.
And since we're sort of a studio audience for a video that will be online and viewed by lots of people, if you're asking a question, please speak up so we can catch it on the video.
Okay. Great. So I'm Tracy Hollister with Marriage Equality USA. I have been a longtime Raleigh resident, 20 years. I just moved back last weekend, 5 minutes away from New York City, where I've lived in the last year. And I'm really glad to be back amongst my colleagues in the profession. And as Jen said, storytelling is really important. It's one of the most important things that we can do. I just wanted to add to something we're working with Equality MC and other groups in the area on, is we are piloting a presentation for the movable middle called The Heart of What Matters. It's story-based, it's designed for mixed audiences, and it's around the question, why is support for marriage equality rising? It's actually one of the fastest growing social opinion changes of our time. So we think that people can be curious and humble, who, regardless of their opinion on the issue, and really the primary answer is because they're getting to know LGBT people. So I wanted to encourage you to do everything that Jen says. And if you are interested in, we need a handful of people interested in being presenters to pilot it. We also are going to be doing this in Georgia and Tennessee and maybe South Dakota and other places. But because I live here, there's an opportunity to field test it here. So I'm looking for people who are good presenters, who don't mind having dialogue with the other side in a diplomatic way, and just come talk to me afterwards.
Tracy will be around here after the program, so come grab her. Thanks.
Thank you.
Other questions or suggestions that folks want to ask for? I have a question for the panel, which is, what are we finding out in the other states? My sense is that, there are no problems. Marriage equality is working out. LGBT people are getting married and getting divorced like straight people, and it's pretty much, all of the terrible stories that we've heard from the opponents is, what's happening in the other states? Am I right? Is that things just kind of
California is becoming even more apocalyptic health.
It's falling into the ocean.
You thought it was bad earlier. No, the sky is not falling. There's already the administrative procedures in place. It's very easy to just, as came up when one of the very conservative judges on the Sixth Circuit asked yesterday during our argument, you're not really going to have to do anything procedurally to change the way Michigan, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee accept marriage licenses. You're just going to get some more happy folks in front of you.
And I will say, I was talking to our counterpart in Tennessee yesterday, who was working to help couples figure out what they can and cannot do. Tennessee politically is in a very similar place. They predated us in many of the regressive laws that we've seen here in North Carolina of late. And so they're in an environment where they're trying to figure out, when marriage rains down upon them, what it will look like for people who do not live in a state of equality. And one of the things that came up is talking to couples about what happened in Michigan when a woman was able to get married and was on the media, very visible, and was attacked a week later in her own community. And of course, we don't have hate crime laws as well. So there are plenty of, this is not to be the harbinger of doom. This is to remind people that marriage doesn't solve everything. And it doesn't in most heterosexual couples, and it won't for us gays and lesbians as well. And so it is worth taking under advisement in our advocacy and our activism at the General Assembly and in communities statewide to educate as many people as possible about these realities when they come to pass. Because relationship recognitions and being able to be who you are and out and open in the military are just a first step in a long process to living in a state of equality here in North Carolina, and these are things to be mindful of. So it's been great for couples to get married. It hasn't always been an easy path following marriage because it doesn't solve everything.
Yeah, and I can't underline that point enough, is that there are two words here. There's marriage equality, and marriage is a wonderful way to tell stories, as Tracy has highlighted and Jen has highlighted. It's also a wonderful way to take a step towards equality. But when we get marriage equality and Amendment 1 is struck down here in North Carolina, that same day I imagine that it'll be a situation where you can be fired for having a picture of your husband or wife on your desk at work, even if you're the best employee in the place. And we have not reached equality when that is the case. So we should go have a couple beers that evening. Jen and I doubtlessly
We'll wear the
will.
same thing.
We'll wear the same thing like we do when we go anywhere together. And then, you'll wake up the next morning and you'll have some other things that you need to work on.
And what would be our model? What are there other state models that we would seek to emulate in terms of non-discrimination laws? Or
We're one of 29 states that currently do not have workplace non-discrimination laws. So like marriage and equality, we're in a majority of states that do not do this. So there will have to be a lot of shifts and turns. We see this in our federal agencies, working on whether it's where you live or your place of celebration, your place of marriage that dictates what rights and benefits you get from the federal government. That will happen on the state level as well. And a lot of foot dragging and a lot of changes and a lot of growing pains that we've seen in other states that got marriage equality even as we're seeing in Massachusetts a decade ago. So we were the last loss here. We just did this. And I think that's incredibly significant because while it was a majority of a minority of North Carolinians who passed Amendment 1 in May 2012, and I want to make that perfectly clear, a lot of people checked that yes box. And many of them checked a yes box who knew gay and lesbian people, knew gay and lesbian couples. It is our job now to move this state forward. And we do that with our stories. And we do that with our work at the General Assembly. Because I believe it is true as with teachers. Teachers are coming out like gay people did and saying how angry they are at a lot of the policies that are going on. Everybody knows a teacher and everybody knows an LGBT person. And that has changed hearts and minds, and you will see it change things in the General Assembly when enough teachers rose up and enough allies of teachers, because everybody's an ally of a teacher, rose up and demanded more pay and more accountability. We can see that here in other ways. And we've got their back. Polling largely says the vast majority of people in North Carolina do support workplace protections for gay and transgender people. This is not up for debate. This is not a political wedge issue, and now's the time to pass it now more than ever.
What state has the best model for this legislation?
Pick your northeastern state.
Yeah.
Well,
No, you have to pick a state that's going to be politically compatible. I mean, they're going to say the damn Massachusetts people, they're crazy. But give me a state that makes some sense.
So I will say before Windsor, before the Windsor case, before DOMA was struck down, what we used to say is in every state that had some form of marriage equality, there were also some form of protections for gay and transgender workers. And that nexus is clear. Okay. If you can be out, open, and visible, you can defend your rights, and you can move people's hearts and minds like Tracy was talking about, even in the conflicted, evolving, movable middle. And so for us, the next step for marriage equality before this meteoric shift was to get workplace protections passed. Because in many states, that was the first step to marriage equality, was being able to be safe and happy at work. And so now marriage is leading. And so we're finding a level of fear that interest in fighting for equality will diminish with our allies when marriage comes to town, because they're not aware that you can be fired for being gay and lesbian for reasons that have nothing to do with job performance, and in many cases don't believe that to be true. So that's a tough sell at the legislature, and it's been a tough sell in communities as well.
Have you ever introduced legislation or?
For the past 8 years, yes, sir.
Here?
Yes, sir.
Would you, I'll give you my card, I'd like to see that.
Okay.
And I think you're signaling a very good point, and a challenge that we will have the day after Amendment 1 gets struck down is that when you only have 21 states that have workplace protections, you're likely going to, when you're looking for models that you'd like to replicate, be pointing at some states that are not the South Carolinas and Tennessees and Virginias of the world. But I would submit to you, we have some models that are modest in comparison with the workplace context, but have proven fully workable and brought great protections into schools here in North Carolina, the anti-bullying legislation that was passed a number of years back that was inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. Guess what? Our public school system continues to, legislators' efforts to the contrary, function with those bullying protections in place. So yes, it's going to be a challenge because we're not going to be able to point at sort of analogous states in a lot of these instances, but we do have some infrastructure that we can build off of here in North Carolina.
Good, thank you.
Bob, did you?
Yeah, how many of our local county governments have employment non-discrimination laws
17.
and ordinances?
I think it's 17. I think it's 5 counties statewide and 12 cities and towns statewide.
So is there any thought to using that as a platform?
Yeah, we
General
currently,
Assembly is.
right. So that's a great question, Bob, because before marriage sucked all the air out of the room, quite literally, we were focused on 32 different cities, counties, and towns all across this great state. And we have models that aren't just Asheville, Chapel Hill. I mean, we're talking Bessemer City, we're talking Franklin, we're talking Boone. These aren't our progressive hubs by any stretch of the imagination. And so we thought that creating a critical mass of cities, towns, and counties all across the state that protect county and city employers on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity would create that critical mass to say, hey, General Assembly, it's A-OK. And I think we're in an environment where that's tricky. And for example, back in Buncombe County, we were passing protections for gay and transgender workers that modeled after Asheville, because counties are a little bit more difficult than cities and towns. The county attorney said that he had gotten a call from the General Assembly, and that inserted in a fracking bill was language that seemed to restrict what they could do on the local level to protect people on this basis. So it isn't without a level of political courage that we're asking our county commissioners, city council, town commissions to pass these things. But we were working with Greenville and almost did it this past summer, led by college students. It's happening in Winston-Salem. They're taking it up for consideration. And this isn't just adding these anew, it's also extending things that haven't existed before, like a human rights ordinance that protects for public accommodations and housing. So all of these things are on the table, and we're working even now to do that, to create that critical mass that the legislature needs to see that the sky didn't fall when these people were protected.
And not only is there a critical mass out there, or we're working towards a critical mass out there in municipalities and in counties, I think we work with Charlotte and Mecklenburg to bring online these sorts of protections. There's also a sort of some conservative messaging that I thought that Charlotte did very effectively, talking about why these protections were necessary. I mean, there's obviously a very good progressive equality-based argument that all of us can easily make and should make. But they also talked about, listen, this is about attracting the best employees to Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. And if we're going to get folks to come and move in from out of state, never been in North Carolina before, and maybe the thing that they read about North Carolina was about our legislature or about Amendment 1 passing, we gosh darn need to be able to point to something else that says, well, here in Charlotte, here's how we do it.
Right.
And listen, I think that it's going to be, that was a challenge making that argument about Amendment 1 in the legislature, but I still think that's an argument that needs to be made, that there are fantastic progressive equality arguments we need to be making, but it's also about making our state as competitive as possible, and that is increasingly linked to having equality in the workplace.
Now the questions are sprouting out. But Dave, let's ask a couple other folks. Mark, did you?
So on the anti-discrimination stuff, I appreciate what you're saying about engaging local and state governments, but the success in the marriage fund has been through litigation. So is there any coordinated national litigation strategy around the anti-discrimination stuff the way there has been around marriage?
Not right now. I think marriage is sort of sucking up a lot of the energy relating to that, and there's the thought that, and certainly before, in the months before marriage got sort of all of the traction, there was very much legislative pushes because of exactly that seemingly causal connection between having workplace protections in place and bringing marriage equality online. I mean, a lot of the anti-discrimination work that we've been doing has been in the school context, working with the Department of Education and their Office of Civil Rights, in particular working right now. There was an episode that occurred that I know Equality was involved in as well, where a transgender student at Central Piedmont Community College was harassed by a school security officer. So using the law that we have there to sort of push back against that sort of harassment has definitely been a focus. I think that the day that we get rid of these state marriage bans, there's, in the weeks that follow, going to be a lot of discussions about what the next litigation effort is. I think until then, that sort of consumes a lot of resources, and understandably and rightly so. But I think that expanding and figuring out exactly how to bring the same equality message into public accommodations, into educational environments, into the employment context is something that needs to be a robust conversation about subsequent to that.
In the back.
What effort have you made to reach out to corporations in North Carolina? Most major corporations have a 20-year history of non-discrimination clauses. And are you reaching out for their support, both politically and in terms of using them as examples of the success of non-discrimination?
I mean, it is as if I planted you in the audience. We're in the process of launching the Business Equality Council, which is, do you remember all those businesses that came out against Amendment 1? Okay. Neither do I. No, I mean, yes, there were, we had 30 business leaders, CEOs, including representatives from Bank of America at the legislature asking people not to pass Amendment 1. Those people are necessarily on board because, like you said, for the past 2 decades, Bank of America, our SASs, these are places where business is leading the way for the rest of the state to just get on board with these common sense updates and these protections to, like Chris said, make our state more attractive, finally, to big business. And we're also approaching small businesses as well to create in these communities the requisite visibility that LGBT people need and allies to know where they can go and spend their dollars and do their best to support pro-equality business across the state. So that will be launching this year, and we're incredibly proud of that, because I think business interests are listened to in our General Assembly, and we need every friend we can get when we try to pass statewide workplace non-discrimination, and they're going to be some of our biggest and best friends, so absolutely, and keep looking for that. It's very similar to an HRC index, but it's local and more accurate, because we're in every town in this great state. And you would be surprised how many small businesses have stood up and spoken out and benefited from speaking out for equality during the Amendment 1 fight. There is a storefront in Shelby, North Carolina, a little coffee shop there that hosted phone banks during Amendment 1, and they were worried, and rightly so, that their business would be harmed by this. Their business has grown exponentially as a result, and pro-equality customers still come in and thank them for their work during Amendment 1. We don't forget, and we won't in this fight as well.
I have a question for Shawn, which is that, Shawn, you're a dad now for 12 years or close to it. Do you see a change? Do you see a change in the response that you're receiving from people at the school, or you told the story of your son being sick, but do you feel hopeful in that regard at all?
Absolutely. I was initially extremely concerned. We live in Wake Forest, which in a lot of ways is a kind of a conservative area. We're actually fairly close to the Southeastern Baptist Seminary, which is an extremely conservative area. So there was some amount of terror, when we're bringing a child into our household in this environment. And I'll always remember a kid came home from kindergarten one day, and he's like, "Hey, Dad, you're my dad, aren't you? And Craig's like, yeah, kid, of course I'm your dad. He's like, hey, Pa, you're my dad. I'm like, yeah, kid, of course I'm your dad too. He's like, well, why are you asking these questions, kid? What's going on? Well, today in class, we talked about all different kinds of families and how you have families that have like 2 dads and 2 moms, or a stepdad, or grandma, or they live with their aunt. I just like, really? You talked about a variety of like different families in kindergarten? It's like, yeah, and we all went around, we stood up, and we told what kind of family we had. And I told how I had 2 dads, and da-da-da. I was like, that's great. And so how did you hear that? So, yes, the younger generation, the whole idea that someone is gay or straight, it's irrelevant to them. They cannot care less. And it's just, I am absolutely hopeful that one incident alone, you know, it's like, oh, okay, it's all going to be all right. Everything is fine.
That's great. That's awesome. Do we have any other, Susan, did you have a question?
Everybody seems to be taken by surprise by the rapidity of this sea change on this issue, both the social change, the change in attitude, as well as the court decisions that followed. So are there specific things that people like you all, specifically you guys, or people like you across the country, did that you can cite that were responsible for that are applicable to other issues? Or were we just really, fortunate in sort of a perfect storm of stuff that worked to make this happen?
Gosh, that is a hard question, and a really good question. And if we can figure out the way to distill what has transpired here, then we need to get together in this room and not leave until we figure out how to do that. I do think that there are some pretty unique features to what has transpired here, and I think a lot of it has to do with people being out and people telling their stories, and they're reaching a critical mass at which, and this has been a very, very recent occurrence, I think, where, and this is going to sound glib, but I don't think it is glib, where being a homophobe has become passé and socially unacceptable in a lot of ways and in a lot of contexts. And especially in the judicial context, I think that is exceptionally significant. The man who wrote the opinion striking down the Virginia marriage ban is a 66-year-old white man from Greenville, South Carolina, who was born in Brevard, North Carolina, went to Wofford, and went to USC Law. The nary a Berkeley in his resume, all right? He was put on the bench originally by George W. Bush. He was elevated by President Obama, but with the strong recommendation of Senator Lindsey Graham. And I think it is hard to imagine that a gentleman with that background, not judging him in any way, I just think that the social construct has opened up in the past generation in such a way that there's been a reappraisal of past beliefs. And so he was on the opinion, I think in a real poetic term, the other person who was on the opinion in Virginia was Roger Gregory, who integrated the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in the year 2000, which we should think about how crazy that is. But the last line of their opinion together is, denying same-sex couples the right to marry, quote, prohibits them from participating fully in our society, which is precisely the type of segregation that the 14th Amendment cannot countenance. So 2 gentlemen, born in the 1950s, who surely, have gone through their own personal evolution in regards to this. White and African-American gentlemen coming together to strike down Virginia's marriage ban, which, really got this started by striking down the interracial marriage ban in the Loving case. To me, it could not be more perfect than the way that worked out. And it's also evidence of the re-examination that the societal conversation, I think, has wrought.
In North Carolina, we remembered who we were. I mean, every state had lost. before Amendment 1. I mean, we often forget we are not the only one, we're just the last one.
Right.
We were put in a terrible circumstance where we had limited time and we had a different kind of election. And during that fight, we remembered who we were. We were Southern, we talked to each other, we have relationships, we have conversations. We spin that yarn and tell that story, and that works. And we took the lessons from Proposition 8 in California, and we didn't go that way. And there was no one left behind in the amount of conversations that we would have during that fight. And I think it's interesting that during that, we were in churches, we were in other marginalized communities. We talked to people regardless of socioeconomic status or who, where they were. We didn't leave anyone behind in this. And when Reverend Dr. William Barber becomes the Harvey Milk of North Carolina, you've done something right, and you've done something that is transferable, a blueprint that lended itself to victories not only in states like Maryland that got marriage equality, that had very similar demographics as North Carolina, but in states like Minnesota who needed to figure out how to use youth outreach to change hearts and minds and to actually get young people to vote. Because it's not told often that the most historic victory is oftentimes the fact that young people voted in record numbers against Amendment 1. And that it was white areas of this state that carried for Amendment 1. And these are narratives that they took to other places and they won. And we very much lost forward, and we lost forward for the entire country, and we are continuing to have lessons that other states use to win. And I'm very, very proud of that.
I think Chris has a
I
question.
do, in my continuing quest to find the half-empty glass. I wonder, when this passed, when Amendment 1 is struck down, Tammy Fitzgerald and Paul Stam and all those guys are not going away. And I
That's what
wonder-
they said.
Well,
Yes.
Well, I wonder, in other
God.
states, what has been the backlash, or has there been, not personally, which Jen has talked eloquently about, people that people face, has there been any policy backlash, or what will they do? Is there other things?
Well, we saw that.
What will the fights be?
We've seen the Don't Say Gay. We've seen the Gay Stay Away bills, where they go to the heart of public accommodation and also where you can work, where you can get contraception. We're seeing the kind of back end to marriage equality and hitting us where it really hurts. Where we want to live, work, and shop. In many,
Yeah, I think a variant on the sort of tortured religious liberty argument that you've seen, I think most recently in Arizona, but in a lot of other states as well. I think that, again, the Arizona example illustrates something we've been talking about repeatedly, which is the business community came out and largely resulted in that not being put in place, because they recognize that creates an inhospitable environment for attracting the best and the brightest. But I think that is going to be the playbook. I'll also note that, to push back against the glass half empty a little bit, you certainly have noted, like I've noted, that the statements become more and more unhinged from that end as the day that Amendment 1 gets struck down comes closer. And the arguments become more vitriol based and even more exclusionary. Talking about the Fourth Circuit decision, these two judges striking down Virginia's marriage ban, stepping into the place of God. Goodness gracious. You really can't. Do you have someone editing this before you send it out? Because this is not the way to. I could write a better press release for you, and I viscerally disagree. So that was telling, but also what Tillis and Berger said in the intervention context was telling as well, because they didn't use that as an opportunity really to stand up strong for Amendment 1. They used it as an opportunity to take pot shots at the Attorney General, and to the extent that they engaged on Amendment 1, they said, "Oh, you're overturning the will of the people." That's not really a substantive argument for why we need Amendment 1. So that change in tenor, I think, should be noted and is encouraging as well.
Yes, it might also be noted that Speaker Tillis said that it would be overturned, although I think he said in 20 years.
Yes.
Happily
He was
been
only
20
wrong by
months.
18 years.
Yeah.